Sophia sat in the corner of the couch, motionless, as the world around her seemed to spin out of control. The room was dark except for a beam of light coming from a poorly drawn curtain. On the coffee table was a pile of disorganized papers, a cold cup of coffee, and her phone, which was constantly flashing with notifications. Each vibration was like a drumbeat resonating in her chest. Her heart felt like it was racing, beating too fast to keep up with her breathing. Her hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold the cup. Her mind was elsewhere, bogged down by thoughts that came and went like waves in a storm. What if I can't finish the report? What will my boss think? What if I get fired? How will I pay my bills? I'm not good enough. I never have been. Sophia had lived with anxiety for so long that she no longer knew what it was like to live without it. It wasn't something that had started out of nowhere. She remembered being a teenager, worried about her grades at school, the looks from her classmates, the constant need to please everyone. But now, as an adult, the anxiety seemed to have turned into something monstrous, a constant presence that loomed over her. At that moment, with the notifications going off on her phone, Sophia felt she could no longer ignore what was happening. She tried to pick up the phone to check her messages, but her hands were so unsteady that she dropped it to the floor. The sound of the impact made her jump. Tears began to stream down her face. It wasn't sadness. It was pure despair. She felt her chest tighten, as if there was a crushing weight preventing her from breathing. She tried to take a deep breath, but it seemed like no air would reach her lungs. Sophia began to curl up on the couch, hugging her knees and rocking back and forth as if the movement could somehow calm the chaos inside her. "Why am I like this? Why can't I be normal?" she murmured to herself, her voice breaking. It wasn't the first time she had had an episode like that, but it felt like the worst. Sophia felt on the verge of a complete breakdown, as if her mind was about to shatter. She remembered a piece of advice she had heard somewhere. When you feel overwhelmed, focus on the present. Notice something around you. She looked around. There was an unlit candle on the bookshelf, a portrait of her family on the wall, but nothing seemed real. Everything seemed distant, as if she were watching her own life from the outside. It was then that her phone vibrated once more, and Sophia decided to check it. It was a message from her sister, Carla. "Hi, are you okay? I missed you. Let's talk." Something about that message broke Sophia's trance. She remembered all the times Carla had insisted that she seek help. "You don't have to deal with this alone," Carla would say. "Anxiety doesn't define who you are. It's just something you're dealing with." With shaking hands, Sophia replied with just 2 words. "I'm not." Less than 10 minutes later, Carla called. Sophia answered, her voice still weak. "Carla, I don't know what to do anymore. I'm so tired of living like this." Carla listened in silence for a few moments before saying, "Sophia, you don't have to face this alone. Let's get help together. I'll send you the contact information for an amazing therapist. She can teach you some things that really help." Although Sophia was reluctant to admit that she needed help, something in her sister's voice made her believe that maybe there was a way out. The conversation was short, but it was enough to plant a small seed of hope in her heart. That night, for the first time in a long time, Sophia was able to sleep a little. It wasn't a peaceful sleep, but it was a start. What she didn't know was that that moment on the couch would be the starting point for a transformation that would change her life forever. Sophia was about to embark on a journey that would teach her that anxiety, while powerful, was not invincible, and that with the right tools she could regain control of her mind, her emotions, and ultimately her life. Sophia has always been known for being a competent, detail-oriented, and dedicated woman. Since childhood, these qualities have made her stand out among her schoolmates. She was the exemplary student who handed in her work on time, got the best grades, and was praised by her teachers. But what few knew was the price Sophia paid to maintain this image. During school, while her classmates slept or went out to have fun, Sophia spent hours reviewing the same page of a book or redoing a piece of work that was already impeccable. If she received a 9.5 on a test, she couldn't celebrate. She tortured herself thinking about what she had done wrong to not get a 10. The anxiety was already there, but at that stage it was seen as perfectionism or just dedication. Time passed, and Sophia grew up. During college, the pressure only increased. She chose a competitive course, full of tight deadlines and public presentations, a real nightmare for someone who already struggled with self-criticism and nervousness. Every time she had to speak in front of the class, Sophia felt as if she were being tried in court. Her heart would race, her hands would sweat, and her voice would tremble, but she hid it well. To the outside, she saw only a hard-working and ambitious young woman. After graduating, Sophia got a job at a large company, something she had always dreamed of. At first, she felt excited and grateful for the opportunity. But soon, the demands began to pile up, and along with them her old companion, anxiety. She would spend sleepless nights reviewing reports that were already perfect, afraid that her boss would find a mistake. She would turn down invitations to go out with friends because she felt that every free second needed to be used to be more productive. What started as an occasional worry turned into something much bigger. Sophia began to live in a constant state of alert. If the phone rang, she would jump. If she received an email outside of working hours, her heart would race. She could no longer turn her mind off. Even in her moments of rest, her head was full of thoughts like, what if this goes wrong? What if someone realizes I'm not good enough? What if I lose everything? Sophia knew something was wrong, but she didn't want to admit it. She had a deep-rooted belief that asking for help was a sign of weakness. After all, she had always been able to handle everything on her own, right? At least, that's what she told herself. The problem was that dealing didn't mean resolving it. It meant pushing her feelings down and pretending they didn't exist. The anxiety began to affect other areas of her life. Sophia began to avoid social situations because she felt she never had anything interesting to say. She avoided talking to her family because she was embarrassed to admit that she wasn't well. Even her physical health began to suffer, constant headaches, tension in her shoulders, and difficulty sleeping. One of the most painful moments was when her best friend Mariana tried to talk to her. "Sophia, you haven't spoken to me in a while. I'm worried about you," Mariana said on a phone call. Sophia responded with the same phrase she told everyone, "I'm just busy." But deep down, she knew she was distancing herself from people because she didn't know how to explain what she was feeling. Meanwhile, at work, things started to fall apart. Sophia, who had always been the impeccable employee, started making small mistakes. A mistyped number here, a forgotten email there. She blamed herself immensely for each slip-up, which only increased her anxiety. It was a never-ending cycle. One day, after yet another sleepless night, Sophia looked in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized herself. Her eyes were sunken, her face tired, and her mind exhausted. It was at that moment that she asked herself the question that would change everything. How long am I going to keep living like this? At that moment, she realized she could no longer ignore the signs. Her anxiety wasn't just something she needed to learn to deal with. It was something that was destroying her quality of life. For the first time, she began to consider seeking help. She remembered her sister's words, "You don't have to deal with this alone." They echoed in her mind, along with the memory of what her life used to be like before her anxiety took over. Sophia felt, for the first time, a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way to change. Maybe she could learn to live without this constant burden. Still, she didn't know where to start. The idea of seeing a therapist seemed daunting, and the idea of trying something like mindfulness. Sophia found it an abstract, almost silly concept. But what she didn't know was that this journey would take her to a point of transformation she never imagined possible. Would you like to continue with the next item? It was an ordinary morning at the office, but for Sophia, it felt like the beginning of a nightmare. She was in the conference room, surrounded by colleagues and company leaders. On the table was a stack of reports that she had spent sleepless nights preparing. The numbers were all correct, the graphs impeccable. But still, Sophia felt an overwhelming uneasiness. The project leader, a middle-aged man with a demanding gaze, asked her to begin her presentation. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Sophia held the papers with trembling hands and tried to smile, but her face felt hot and her heart was beating like a drum. She began to speak, but soon realized that her voice wasn't coming out as it should. It was shaky, weak, almost as if someone else was speaking in her place. The words began to jumble together. The numbers she had memorized disappeared from her mind, and all that was left was an awkward silence. Sophia looked around, seeing confused and impatient expressions. She felt as if she was being judged by every person in the room, as if they were waiting for her to fail. She felt short of breath. A feeling of heat rose through her body, her hands were sweating and her head began to spin. It was then that anxiety took over. "Excuse me, I need a moment," she said, standing up quickly. Before anyone could respond, Sophia left the room, leaving behind a trail of bewilderment. She went straight to the office bathroom, locking herself in a stall. There, she collapsed. Tears fell uncontrollably as she desperately tried to catch her breath. She put her hands over her chest, trying to control her heart that was beating so fast it felt like it was going to explode. "Why am I like this? Why can't I just do what everyone else does without panicking?" she whispered to herself. Sophia knew that this crisis was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of accumulated anxiety. After a few minutes, she managed to compose herself enough to leave the bathroom. She passed her colleagues in the hallway with a look that begged them not to talk to her. She returned to her desk, pretending to be busy, but inside, she felt a crushing weight of shame and defeat. That day, Sophia couldn't go back to the meeting room. She sent an email to the project leader, apologizing and promising that she would send the presentation in writing. What tormented her most was not the mistake itself, but the fear that everyone would now see her as weak, incapable, and emotionally unstable. When she got home that night, the scene in the bathroom repeated itself. Sitting on the couch with her hands on her head, Sophia cried, feeling like she was at a dead end. Anxiety seemed like an entity that followed her wherever she went, an invisible enemy that she didn't know how to defeat. She recalled the last few months, realizing how her life had become a constant battle. From the small challenges of everyday life to bigger moments like her presentation at work, anxiety was always there, suffocating her. For the first time, Sophia admitted to herself that she couldn't go on like this anymore. It was then that she remembered the conversation with her sister, Carla. The words echoed in her mind. "You don't have to face this alone." Sophia picked up the phone and hesitantly looked up Carla's number in her address book. She called, even though she felt a lump in her throat. "Hi, Sophia. How are you?" Carla answered with her usual cheerful voice. But Sophia couldn't hide her pain. "Carla, I'm not okay. I can't deal with this alone anymore. I need help." Carla, noticing the urgency in her sister's voice, immediately changed her tone. "I'm here, Sophia. We're going to work through this together. Have you thought about seeing a therapist? It might be a good start." The idea of therapy was scary to Sophia, but at that moment she knew she had no choice. Accepting help was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It was the only way to regain control over her life. Enviar feedback paines lateres historicos salvus. Carla sent her the contact details of a therapist who specialized in anxiety and recommended that Sophia try something called mindfulness, explaining that it was a way to learn to be in the present and deal with anxiety triggers. Sophia didn't know much about the subject, but she was willing to try anything. That night, for the first time in months, she managed to get some sleep. It wasn't perfect sleep, but it was a start. Sophia knew she still had a long way to go, but taking that first step, admitting that she needed help, was a victory in itself. She didn't know that by trying mindfulness, she would discover powerful tools to transform her life. From that moment on, Sophia was at the beginning of a journey that would take her back to herself. Sophia arrived at her first therapy session carrying the weight of shame and doubt. The idea of talking about her anxiety to someone seemed as uncomfortable as the anxiety itself. But there she was, sitting in a cozy armchair in front of a therapist with a calm and welcoming look on her face. "So, Sophia, tell me what brought you here today," the therapist said in a calm voice. Sophia hesitated for a moment, but then the words began to come out in a jumbled fashion. She told about the crisis at work, the sleepless nights, and how she felt like she was living in a constant state of alert. "I just want it to stop. I want to be myself again," she confessed in a choked voice. The therapist listened attentively, without interrupting, and when Sophia finished, she said something that intrigued her. "Sophia, I want to introduce a tool that can help you deal with these moments of anxiety. Have you ever heard of mindfulness?" Sophia raised her eyebrows. "Oh, isn't that the kind of thing where you meditate and think about nothing?" "I don't know if that's for me. My mind never stops." The therapist smiled. "I understand how you feel, but mindfulness isn't about emptying your mind. It's about learning to focus on the present, one moment at a time. Let's try something simple today. If it doesn't work for you, that's okay, but it could be the start of something very transformative." Reluctantly, Sophia agreed. The therapist suggested starting with a basic exercise called 5-4-3-2-1. This is a grounding exercise, something you can use when you feel like your anxiety is out of control, the therapist explained. They began together. "Look around the room and name 5 things you can see," the therapist instructed. Sophia looked around, still suspicious. The table, the plant in the corner, the lamp, your chair, and the window," she replied, trying to ignore the skepticism growing inside her. "Good. Now, name 4 things you can feel," the therapist continued. Sophia touched the arms of the chair. "The fabric of the chair, my clothes, the hair falling in my face, and my hands," she said, now beginning to feel a slight interest in the exercise. 3 things you can hear, your watch, the sound of the air conditioning, and the sound of cars outside. And so they continued, going through the 2 things Sophia could smell and 1 she could taste. When they were done, Sophia realized that something had changed. It wasn't a magical transformation, but for the first time in a long time, her mind seemed a little quieter. "How do you feel now?" the therapist asked. I don't know. It feels like my head has slowed down a bit," Sophia admitted, a hint of surprise in her voice. "This is mindfulness," her therapist explained. "It's a muscle you can train. At first, it might feel awkward or useless, but over time, you'll see the benefits." Sophia left that session with mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was relieved to have found someone who seemed to understand her struggle. On the other, she still wasn't convinced that these exercises would be enough to deal with something as big as her anxiety. Over the next few days, Sophia tried implementing the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise whenever she felt her anxiety starting to rise. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Impatience began to creep in. "Maybe this isn't for me," she thought. In a subsequent session, her therapist suggested something new, guided meditation. "I know your mind is very active, so a guided meditation can help you focus," she said. Sophia downloaded a recommended app and gave it a try that night. The experience was strange. As she closed her eyes and listened to the guide's gentle voice, Sophia realized how agitated her mind was. Thoughts about work, unanswered emails, and even the next day's dinner were constantly invading her. But the guide's voice kept saying, "If your mind wanders, that's okay. Just bring your attention back to your breathing." Sophia tried to follow the instructions, but felt frustrated. "My mind won't stop. This will never work for me," she thought. In the next session, she shared her difficulties with the therapist. "It's normal to feel this way at first," the therapist said with a reassuring smile. "The idea is not to stop your thoughts, but to change your relationship with them. Let's keep trying, one step at a time." Despite her doubts, Sophia decided to give it another try. She began making small adjustments to her routine, taking 5-minute breathing breaks between tasks, taking short walks without her phone to disconnect, and writing down anxious thoughts in a notebook. Little by little, something began to change. It wasn't a quick or dramatic transformation, but Sophia began to notice moments of calm amidst the chaos. When her phone rang or a notification popped up, her heart no longer raced in the same way. It was as if she was learning to create a small space between the stimulus and the response. Sophia still had a lot to learn, but she was now ready to explore mindfulness further. Her initial skepticism was being replaced by a mild curiosity. Maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to this idea of focusing on the present. Sophia was beginning to incorporate small moments of mindfulness into her routine, but she still had a long way to go. Although she had experienced some moments of calm, she still felt anxious in situations that she considered challenging. It all culminated in an event that would test her progress in an unexpected way. One morning, while at work, Sophia was called into an emergency meeting. Her boss had asked her to present a project she had been working on for the past few months, but she hadn't had time to review the details since she had last worked on it. As soon as she received the news, the familiar weight of anxiety began to settle in. Her heart raced, her palms grew sweaty, and her mind began to race with catastrophic thoughts. What if I forget something important? What if they realize I'm not good enough? Sophia walked into the conference room, feeling like she was going to a trial. The room was filled with important people, colleagues, managers, and even members of senior management. As everyone settled in, she felt her anxiety rising like a wave about to crash. When it was her turn to speak, Sophia began her presentation, but she soon realized that her voice was shaking. The words seemed to be jumbled together, and the numbers on the slides she had prepared seemed to float across the screen. Her mind was so overwhelmed that she could barely keep track of what she was saying. Then it happened. She froze. An uncomfortable silence filled the room as everyone stared at her, waiting for her to continue. At that moment, Sophia felt like the anxiety was about to overwhelm her completely. She could feel the heat rising through her body, her heart beating so fast it felt like it was bursting out of her chest. She wanted to run away, like she had done before, but something inside her told her to try something different this time. What if I try that exercise the therapist taught me? She hesitated, but decided to give it a try. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, she took a deep breath, trying to focus only on the air, moving in and out of her lungs. Then she looked around the room and mentally identified 5 things she could see: the projector screen, a colleague's notepad, the pen on the table, the glass of water in front of her, and the folders stacked in the corner. Then she tried to feel the fabric of the chair she was sitting on and the texture of the paper in her hands. This pause lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Sophia to regain a small part of her equilibrium. When she opened her eyes again, the world seemed less oppressive. She began to speak again, this time with a little more clarity. It wasn't a perfect presentation, but she managed to finish without running from the room. After the meeting, Sophia felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, she was relieved that she had survived the moment. On the other, she felt frustrated that she hadn't performed as well as she would have liked. But something different happened. Instead of beating herself up like she usually did, she remembered what her therapist had said in one of their sessions. Progress isn't linear. Every little win counts. That night, as she reflected on what had happened, Sophia realized something important. For the first time, she hadn't let anxiety take over. Even in a moment of extreme stress, she was able to use a tool she was learning to create a small pause between the chaos and her response. That was a turning point. Over the next few weeks, Sophia continued to practice mindfulness more consistently. She began incorporating simple exercises into her daily routine, such as paying attention to the feeling of the water while washing her hands, or pausing for a minute to breathe deeply before responding to a difficult email. Little by little, these practices began to create a foundation of calm that helped her deal with daily challenges in a more balanced way. Still, Sophia knew she wasn't cured. There were days when her anxiety would come back with a vengeance, and she felt like she was regressing. But now, instead of beating herself up, she tried to accept these moments as part of the process. As her therapist once said, anxiety is not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of you that needs to be understood and cared for. The turning point wasn't just about that moment in the boardroom. It was about realizing that she had power over how she responded to her anxiety, even if she couldn't eliminate it completely. Sophia began to believe that with practice and patience, she could rebuild her life in ways that had previously seemed impossible. She still had a lot to learn, but that moment proved that she was on the right track. For the first time in a long time, Sophia felt like she had the tools to face whatever came her way. Sophia began to notice subtle but significant changes in her life. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, like her anxiety suddenly disappearing, but day by day, the moments when she felt overwhelmed by it were becoming less frequent. What had once been a constant state of alertness now appeared as manageable spikes, moments that she could face with more clarity. She remembered her therapist saying, "Mindfulness isn't a magic bullet. It's a practice that teaches you to be present, to create space between stimulus and response." And indeed, Sophia was beginning to notice that space. The true test of her transformation came one morning that began like any other. Sophia was at home, sipping coffee while reviewing her appointments for the day on her laptop. Suddenly, a notification popped up, an unexpected invitation to an important meeting with company leadership. This time there was no time to prepare. She knew she would have to improvise and answer questions about an ongoing project. Immediately, Sophia felt the old pattern trying to re-establish itself. Her heart began to race, and her mind began to form disaster scenarios. What if I mess up? What if they realize I don't know everything? What if this costs me my job? But this time something was different. She recognized the signs before they overwhelmed her. Instead of letting the wave of anxiety sweep her away, she decided to put what she had learned into practice. She stopped, closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep, slow, deliberate breath. In, out, in, out. That's it. Then she placed her feet firmly on the floor and focused on the sensation of contact with the ground. Mentally, she repeated to herself, "I am here. I am capable. I don't have to be perfect. I just have to do my best." When she arrived at the meeting, Sophia felt the anxiety again. There was no way she could ignore it completely, but instead of running away from it, she accepted it as part of the moment. She remembered one of the exercises her therapist had taught her, labeling feelings without holding on to them. She thought to herself, "I'm feeling anxious, and that's okay. It doesn't mean I can't do it." The meeting began, and Sophia was called to speak. She took a deep breath, looked up, and began explaining the project. Her words were still a little hesitant, but she was present. When a difficult question came up, Sophia resisted the urge to panic. Instead, she gave herself a second to process and calmly responded, "That's a great question. I'll check the data and send you a more detailed answer after the meeting." This approach surprised not only others, but also herself. At the end of the meeting, one of the managers approached her and said, "Great presentation, Sophia. It was clear and to the point. Thank you for your contribution." She was surprised. "I did it. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough." That evening, Sophia reflected on how she had handled the situation. What had changed was not that the anxiety had disappeared. It was still there. But now, Sophia had tools to manage it. Instead of getting lost in catastrophic thoughts, she was able to ground herself in the present moment, and that made all the difference. Sophia's transformation wasn't just internal. People around her began to notice. Her sister, Carla, commented at a Sunday lunch, "You seem calmer, more confident. What's changed?" Sophia smiled and replied, "I'm learning to deal with things differently. It's not easy, but it's working. Even at work, colleagues noticed the difference. She began to be seen as more centered and balanced, which led to opportunities that had previously seemed out of reach. Sophia was no longer just the efficient employee, but now she was someone others trusted. However, Sophia knew that the journey was far from over. Mindfulness was not something she could practice for a while and then abandon. It was a lifelong skill, something that required ongoing practice. But rather than feeling overwhelmed by it, she was grateful to have found a path. The culmination of her transformation was not about a specific event, but about the realization that she was capable of changing her relationship with anxiety. Sophia learned that anxiety did not have to control her. She had the power to choose how she responded to it, and that lesson was more valuable than anything else. A few months after that day at the meeting, Sophia was at home on the same couch where it all seemed to have begun. But this time, the scene was different. The pile of disorganized papers was gone, nor was the phone blinking uncontrollably. Instead, a cup of hot tea sat on the table and a candle lit, filling the room with soft light and the calming scent of lavender. Sophia held a notebook in her hand, something her therapist had suggested as a way to practice mindfulness daily. The notebook was filled with small entries, moments of gratitude, reflections on her feelings, and even drawings she drew to disconnect from the digital world. It was a tangible symbol of how her relationship with anxiety had changed. That day, Sophia wasn't worried about unanswered messages or her next meeting at work. Instead, she was present. She watched the gentle rustling of the leaves on the tree outside her window and felt the warmth of the cup in her hands. What had once seemed impossible, being in the present moment without being swept away by anxiety, was now part of her routine. Still, Sophia knew that her anxiety hadn't completely disappeared. There were days when it would creep up on her, bringing that old, tight feeling in her chest. But now Sophia recognized it as a part of her, not an enemy that needed to be fought. When these moments happened, she had tools to deal with them. Deep breathing, sensory grounding, guided meditation. These were all part of the arsenal she had built up over time. One memory in particular came to mind frequently: the bathroom meltdown at work months ago. She remembered the despair, the feeling that there was no way out. But now, looking back, she saw that moment as a turning point, the beginning of a journey that would lead her to a place of greater self-compassion and balance. At work, Sophia had also noticed changes. Her colleagues had come to trust her more, not just for her efficiency, but for the calm and clarity with which she handled stressful situations. Her boss even mentioned that Sophia was an example of resilience and adaptability, words she never expected to hear about herself. One of the most memorable moments happened during a recent meeting. A new colleague was visibly nervous about presenting a project. Sophia recognized the signs: shaky hands, hesitant voice, rapid breathing. When the meeting ended, she approached him and said, "You did really well. I know how hard it is when anxiety sets in at these times. If you need help, I'm here to help." It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. For Sophia, it was proof that her transformation was expanding beyond herself. Her ability to cope with anxiety was now helping her support others in similar situations. Through her mindfulness practice, Sophia also rediscovered things she had left behind. She reconnected with her family and friends, attending gatherings she had previously avoided for fear of not knowing what to say or do. She relearned how to laugh genuinely and even allowed herself to explore new hobbies, such as painting and gardening. One afternoon, while she was painting on her porch, Carla, her sister, came to visit her. Watching Sophia, Carla said, "You have changed so much. It is so good to see you like this, happy and calm." Sophia smiled. "It was not easy to get here, but I learned that I do not need to get rid of anxiety to live well. I just need to know how to deal with it, and that gave me freedom." Sophia's journey did not have a set end, because she knew that the process of taking care of her mental health was ongoing. But at that moment, she felt more equipped than ever to face whatever came her way. She had gone from being consumed by anxiety to learning from it, seeing mindfulness as not just a technique, but a path to living with more purpose and presence. As the sun began to set, Sophia closed her notebook and looked out the window. Outside, the pages were still gently rustling in the wind. She took a deep breath, feeling the connection between the present moment and the path she had taken to get there. For the first time in a long time, Sophia felt at peace. Sophia's story is a powerful reminder that anxiety, while challenging, doesn't have to define who you are. With tools like mindfulness, the right support, and patience with yourself, you can turn even the most difficult moments into opportunities for growth. If you're struggling with something similar, remember that the first step, though daunting, can be the beginning of a journey to a more balanced and meaningful life. And just like Sophia, you too can find ways to be more present and more connected to who you truly are.